Hello, I'm Dr. Y.Olusoga from the School of Education at the University of Sheffield. My talk today is the working class child and the sensory construction of the Dame School and the Day School. So my talk focuses on mid-19th century debates about working class mass education that focus on two key discursive fabrications of the child and of the school. But it's important, although my focus is discursive, to stress that I'm looking at the discursive disconstruction of a child who is embodied and of the school, which is a material, relational and sensory space. So sensory history has been of interest to various historians in recent years. McCulloch in 2011 argued that the history of education in the 19th century and beyond had yet to register a sensory dimension. And he drew on the work of Mark M. Smith, who argued for new historical research on the sensory worlds of children. McCulloch, in his paper, examined the school visit reports of James Bryce, who was an assistant commissioner to the 1868 Schools Inquiry Commission. And McCulloch notes the strong sensory and emotive elements in its judgments of middle-class education, covering a broad sensory register of taste, smell and sound, no less than sight, reflecting an interest in the material reality of the schools Bryce visited. This paper looks at an earlier commission, the Newcastle Commission of 1861, but with this idea of sensory history in mind, and particularly looking at how judgments were made of, in this case, working class education, but again drawing on the sensory register and the linking of the sensory with emotional and material reality. So the Newcastle Commission reported in 1861, and it had been commissioned to inquire into the present state of popular education for the masses and to consider and report on what measures, if any, were required to extend elementary education on the basis of it being sound but also cheap. The report, when it was published, was an articulation of the prevailing debates and tensions on both the subject of education, but also of the working classes and particularly working class children. From a Foucauldian perspective, it's important to remember that this discourse constructs rather than reflects reality. The report draws on and constructs a complex set of discourses about the working class child, family and community. The approach to analysis I take focuses on the use of discursive strategies, and I deploy the discourse historical approach to critical discourse analysis to analyse how discourses are put to work in the text via intertextual references, naming, characterisation of people and groups, perspectivisation, and the use of argumentation strategies. And the argumentation strategies, particularly the idea of topoi or topo singular, the idea that a line of argument is constructed based on certain predicates and used to then construct a case for a particular viewpoint and therefore a particular course of action. So argumentation strategies and topoi are very useful and important discursive tools in policy writing then and now. Another key idea from discourse analysis is the idea of ideology, and Rissagil and Wodak talk about the three imaginaries of ideology. The first being an imaginary of the specific vision of the status quo, the second being a specific utopian vision of the future, and the third a specific programme of activity that would develop the former into the latter. When we consider these imaginaries in relation to elementary education in the report of the Newcastle Commission, then the vision of the status quo becomes a vision of the working class child that is portrayed within the pages of the report. The utopian vision of the future becomes the way the working class school child, the idealised working class school child, is portrayed in the report. And the programme of activity to transform the former into the latter it's really focused on an argument presented in the report that it's necessary to have a move away from self-organisation by the poor of schooling for the poor in the dame schools and other forms of school towards attendance at government-inspected day schools. So I'm interested in how these discourses manifest in the official texts of the mid-19th century and how competing discourses or discourses of resistance are dealt with, but with also this attending to the sensory and the material. So I'm going to be talking through analysis of two descriptive passages from the report of the Newcastle Commission that discuss the dame school and the day school. And this allows us to uncover how the dame school and the day school were discursively positioned in material and sensory terms as moral or immoral spaces for children. We also can examine how their capacities for containing the body and the agency of the working class child and for disciplining and transforming it into a working class school child were compared. So the first extract covers 5 pages looking at the dame school, and it's discursively constructed via layers of overlapping testimony. They're drawn from official minutes of the Committee of Council on Education over a number of decades, the reports of 3 of the Assistant Commissioners to the Newcastle Commission, and evidence from Mr. Shields, who is a London headmaster running a day school in an infant department. So I'm sharing with you here an image of a painting of a dame school, and it's striking in a number of ways. We see that it is a space that is filled with children. They're sitting in various places around the room. 2 of them are standing next to the dame school teacher. We can see also elements of the domestic. We can see pots and pans on shelves. We can see a fireplace with what looks like washing that is drying. So within the report, we start to see from the very beginning a problematizing of the dame schools, and I'm going to talk through a number of direct quotes from the report. So we have here talking about the general character of the schools being the same in every part of the country. Women are always the teachers, they are generally advanced in life, and their school is usually the kitchen, sitting and bedroom and the scene of all their domestic occupations. Another quote there, the dame schools are apt to be close, crowded and dirty. Citing the report of Assistant Commissioner Mr. Winder, talking about schools in Rochdale. The usual scene in these schools is a cottage kitchen in which the mistress divides her time between her pupils and her domestic duties. The children sit around the room, often so thickly stowed as to occupy every available corner, and spend the greater part of their time in knitting and sewing. At intervals, the mistress calls them up, 1 or 2 at a time, and teaches the alphabet in easy words, the highest proficiency attained being the power of a little reading in the New Testament. So here we've got this idea of a teacher who is not focused on her tasks, but whose interests are divided because of the location within a domestic space. We also have this idea of overcrowding, of children being thickly stowed, so pressing against each other, but also what they're engaged in doing being domestic, knitting and sewing, very little in the way of reading, which is held to be proper learning. Another assistant commissioner is quoted, but here's actually him reporting an informant, so it's a secondary source. And again, having established the whole one room for every purpose bit, we have here the scholars may often be seen sitting around the sides of the 4-post bed on low forms, the sides of the bed forming a back to the seat, sometimes on the side of the bed. So the idea of the children being in contact with and sitting against or on the bed. When the children are present, the atmosphere is always oppressive to me. And often if I stay in it for 10 minutes without opening the window, it makes me sick. So that's a really quite graphic testimony there of a sensory nature about the idea of the air being stale, oppressive, unhealthy, and an emotive response to being in that atmosphere for too long. The Assistant Commissioner himself now is cited as saying that I have seen the children as closely packed as birds in a nest and tumbling over each other like puppies in a kennel. So they've gone from being scholars to being likened to birds and puppies. And again, this idea of being tightly packed together and tumbling about each other. And the final Assistant Commissioner, Mr. Foster, is his evidence is presented talking about in one of these schools, Mr. Foster saw at dinner in the midst of the children a collier and his mistress, the mistress's husband, sorry, and 2 lodgers fresh from the pit. So mine workers fresh from the pit. So again, they're presumably covered in dust from the pit. Who after their meal would in all probability proceed to undress and wash themselves in the same place. So again, highly speculative, but it's intimating this potential for the children to be exposed to inappropriate sites. So I think 3 themes are developed within this passage. Certainly the educational worth of the dame schools is questioned repeatedly. The informal nature of the dame schools is also presented as lacking in comparison to the formal institution of the school, formal school. And the domestic location of the dame schools is heavily problematized in language that highlights the sensory environment and links it to themes of physical and leading to moral contagion. So discursive strategies at work, the discussion is heavily perspectivized. It's built on a foregrounding and intensification of the official judgments of the assistant commissioners and the unnamed informant. And children are named and characterized as creatures to be contained and who lack proper supervision. There are possible perspectives that are completely absent from the section, those particularly of the child, the parent, and of the dames themselves. So the testimony, I feel, is highly sensory and emotive, emphasising the superior position of those who are making the official judgments. Their sensory sensitivity is held to be reflective of their inherent refinement, and that the lack of sensitivity, similar sensitivity amongst the children and the dame schools, reflective of their inherent contaminating debasement. Strategies for augmentation that are advanced deploy the deploy of both numbers and threat. Something must be done because there are so many dame schools and so many children attending them, but also that the dame schools pose an educational and potentially moral threat. And the use of metaphors emphasizes and intensifies the argument. So this overcrowding of children in multiple inherently inappropriate dame school sites and linked to this idea of a moral threat of being in such close sensory extra-familial contact. So we move on to the day school, and the day school is held in opposition to the dame school. So again, the image I've shown you here is to reflect what is portrayed really in the extract we're going to look at here. So unlike the painting we saw before, this is very clinical, it's devoid of people, there's nothing soft there, it's all hard lines, hard surfaces, and open. So the extract about the day school runs to 6.5 pages about the day school in total. And 6 of those pages focus on existing debates about the religious character of day schools, because that is a real focus of lots and lots of tension and debate in the mid-Victorian period. And there is repeated and detailed evidence presented, drawn from the reports of all 10 assistant commissioners who report on all areas of the country, and they cite a lot of nameless religious and educational informants. The final page, half page, sets out a description of the day school as developed in the contemporary government-supported and inspected education system, as you can call it, a system. And the description covers its pedagogical and spatial organisation, very striking, particularly in relation to what's come just before it, that no intertextual references are made within it. So it starts off by focusing on the school as a network of pedagogical relations. So it emphasizes that the schools, the system of schools is fairly uniform, and in all schools we have pupils and teachers, and in more efficient schools we have teachers who are assisted by apprentices who help to instruct the children and receive instruction. We then move on to a description which is really establishing the day school as a structured space for schooling. So we have this idea of the school usually consists of a single large room, long and narrow, with 3 rows of parallel desks rising above each other on one side and divided by passages through the desks, and often by curtains into as many divisions as there are to be classes. The master's desk is on the opposite side, so he faces the pupils. And we do have a little bit more about the structure of the school day and the school week. So key features of the text here. We have a focus on the physical organisation, and the school is established as a serious and formal institution characterised by conformity, regularity and order. It's a single room for a single purpose, in contrast to the dame schools where the mixing of public and private space is a problem. It's full of purpose-built furniture that is set out in a particularly regular way that keeps the children separate from the master and from each other, and emphasises their relative subject positions. And the passages between the rows allow surveillance by the teacher and by the apprentices. Other key features really focus on authority and power. And again, if we contrast that with the dame school, it's interesting. So the dame school was a gendered space in that it was run by women, and that was seen to be problematic. But the day school, the master is in charge. The master's desk is set facing the children. So the children aren't standing around, facing the teacher. And the teacher is therefore established as a focus of authority and the source of knowledge. And there's a hierarchy with the flow of authority coming from the teacher to the apprentices and then to the pupils. So the day school becomes focused and framed as an institution sanctioned by government that houses and facilitates what Foucault would argue are the multiple technologies of power. I think the very striking part of this extract is the sensory silence. The sensory details are largely missing or to be inferred. There's no mention of the numbers of children or any crowding of them into the space. The focus is on organisation of the space via the ordered hierarchical placement of desks, which are purpose-built educational furniture. The only soft material mentioned is the curtain, sometimes used as a means of dividing the room, and there's no mention of how effective they might be as dividers, no mention of smell, noise, light, movement of air. So it's a clinical and partial description, and as somebody who has worked in and was educated in Victorian school buildings, not particularly realistic. The discursive strategies at work here, I think there's an emphasis on uniformity, so that other ways of organising a day school are considered not worthy of notice. So this is authority, an appeal to authority. Discursively, brevity acts to create and intensify the impression of the school buildings and the contents as being part of the established machinery of the nascent education system. So the argumentation for me rests on the deploy of definition, authority and of history. And the day schools become framed as material spaces that support, shape and make possible the performance of the roles of teacher, pupil and apprentice via their inbuilt disciplinary architecture of relations. So in constructing the sanctioned or unsanctioned school, this report is constructing the school child and the child. So there's an official discourse that supports education of the working class, but not education by the working class. The transition from working class child into working class school child only can happen in the sanctified spaces of the day school. And the spatial and sensory experience of the dame school poses an educational and moral threat compared to the relational, material and spatial organisation of the day school, which removes that threat and raises the child above the status of creature. The day school child is sorted into a seat, kept under surveillance and orientated towards the teacher. Thus, the problematic sensory world of the domestic space is contained. An exposure to the controlled, relational and sensory space of the classroom creates the schooled child from whom the adult citizen can be forged. Thank you.